Well, I think now we're going to do something that I would characterize as hard, because so much of the energy transition and energy world discussion, you talk about a lot of flavors, but really at the end of the day, what you're talking about is power, and power is not an easy thing to understand. You saw from some of Michael's slides that it's organized in different ways. It has many different flavors. It has regulation. It has the absence of regulation. And so power is the flavor where it all comes together, and power is the flavor that's most complicated. But we have a stunningly great panel here to talk about what's going on in power. So we pulled it together from a few different angles. My old friend Pete Labat is the managing partner at Energy Capital Partners. So ECP is just an extremely large investor in the broad-based power space, and they've been doing it for almost the last 20 years. And before that, the team was doing other things in power. So an extensive knowledge of power as an investor and a transactional knowledge. Maria Korsnick here to my right. Maria is the president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute. Nuclear is, you heard a little bit as well from our kickoff conversation, it's such an important component. It is the power with the lowest impact. You get into all kinds of debates about nuclear, timing, cost, and waste, etc. There's nobody better than Maria to talk about it. Before she was the president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, she was running nuclear power plants. So her knowledge of nuclear is very operational and detailed. Bill Flores. Bill Flores is a longtime friend. Bill has combined a career in oil and gas and in power with 10 years in Washington, D.C. So when it comes to perspectives across that whole landscape, nobody's better. And then Stacey Doré. Stacey is a phenomenal ad, not just because she's very talented and has a great perspective, but she's with Vistra, and so Vistra is a Dallas-based, extremely large power company. So they're directly involved in all of these questions, all of these issues. They feel it from investors, regulators, their own people, their clients, etc. So this is just a dream panel to try to get our heads around power. So the question is where to start, because there's a lot to wade into. Maybe to set the stage, I'm gonna ask you, Bill.
Oh no.
Sorry, I had to do it.
I'll get even.
But you will. But so, Bill, your vantage point, I mentioned it. It's been government, it's ERCOT, it's oil and gas. There's so many things over the years that you have a perspective on. Set the stage a little bit for us on what is happening in power, what you notice, what's on your radar, good and bad. Just kind of help us set the stage a little bit, because this is a big, gnarly casserole of a lot of things happening at the same time.
Okay. Well, let me start with three things. One is a disclaimer. I'm speaking here on my own behalf, not on behalf of ERCOT or the PUC or the governor or the legislature. So the views that I share with you today are my own. Most of them are reasonably well fact-based. The second comment I want to add is that I believe Dan Brouillette was qualified to be Energy Secretary.
This is going to be every.
The third thing is I feel kind of like Tim Leach. I'm one of the token Aggies as part of this group, but I'm proud to be here. But to get to your question, Maynard, we have several factors out there. They're all pushing against each other that are causing a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, that means you have less commitment of capital to a particular area. And so right now you've got environmental rules. For instance, there are 5 EPA rules out there, all of which hurt Texas supply demand when it comes to electricity. 4 would reduce the amount of thermal dispatchable generation. 1 would increase the demand side. So you've got a lot of government policy that is causing people to scratch their heads, and that uncertainty, like I said, causes capital to not be deployed when you need capital. So we're blessed here in Texas because we have a fast-growing state, we've got a fast-growing economy, but we're also somewhat cursed by that because at the same time, even though we're adding lots of intermittent renewable energy, we're not adding any thermal energy to back that up. And as you heard from Michael Simla's comments, very first thing this morning is that as you add intermittent resources, you need to have thermal resources to back it up. And you also have people that are promoting their own ideas out there. I mean, I got so tired of the headlines the last few weeks when the Texas grid got tied several times. You know, some people said solar saved the grid, some people said wind saved the grid, some people said batteries saved the grid. I can guarantee you if Stacy's fleet hadn't been operating, or if we hadn't had the wind and the batteries and the solar and consumers and industry reducing demand, we would have had a lot different outcome than we did. So I think what I'd like to see is more clarity instead of the confusion that we see in the market today, so that people can begin to make capital decisions to put steel in the ground. We need tens of billions of dollars of new dispatchable generation built in this state. And if we don't do that, we're going to have some challenges being able to meet the growth profile that we've had. We set 10 new demand records this summer. And the top demand record in August versus the top demand record from last July was up 7%. Most people think a 1 or 2%, when it comes to electricity, 1 or 2% grid growth is kind of average, or that's extreme. We had 7%. And then when you look at last year's September record versus this year's September record, it was up 16%. So that's what we're looking at. And a lot of that was heat related, but then you've got to unpack and try to figure out how much of that is actually economic related. I hope that answers your question. It shows you the level of the competing pressures that we have on the grid.
I just want, if you'll just throw in one more thing for us, and then I'm going to ask Stacy to comment, so if we could get Stacy's slides ready. But Bill, between growth in Texas, it's a great microcosm for us to have this conversation between, growth, more industry, more people, so on and so forth, electrification, where we're just, choosing to substitute. If you add up all the factors, how much is power growth just order of magnitude between now and in the next decade? How much is it going up in Texas?
In the next decade, it's hard to get good numbers on this, but my analysis would tell me that we're going to have 25% power growth at least. And some of that's going to be dependent upon the uptake of EVs, the uptake of heat pumps and electrification, things like that. So it's really hard to tell, but I would guess 25%.
So that's obviously a really big number. And help me with one more number. If you looked at the growth in power over the last decade or the last 20 years, I think what I'm setting the stage for, at a time when we're trying to change the system, we're growing faster in power than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing I left out is too, climate change is affecting all the grids around the world, and so there's an element of climate change that's increasing demand. I don't know what that is. But looking back the last 20 years, I don't have the exact number, but I believe if you look nationwide, 2% is an annual average growth rate. So I've got some smart people here who can probably correct it.
Well, we'll dig out some more numbers, but I think you did exactly what we needed, which is to set the stage. So Stacy, maybe we could turn to you to set the stage, because you're an operator. You have power facilities, a big power company, not just in Texas. So you see a lot of perspectives. You've got some great slides that I think really kind of touch on these issues, and then we can get Pete and Maria talking.
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. Well, thanks for having me here. First of all, I just want to say, and I appreciate Bill's comment. I just want to start with, I'm just extremely proud of the way Vistra's fleet has operated this summer. It has been a tight summer in Texas, and there were many days where, I went to what we call our power optimization center that's in our headquarters in Dallas, and we've got, plant managers sitting around a table just kind of watching the grid and doing everything we could to keep our coal, gas, nuclear, solar, and batteries on. So Vistra is in every form of generation in terms of being an owner-operator other than wind. We do not own wind plants, but we are a large off-taker of wind. And we recently announced a transaction in March to buy a company called Energy Harbor to add 3 nuclear fleets to our Comanche Peak nuclear plant that we own here in Texas. So when that transaction closes, hopefully later this year, we will own 4 nuclear plants. We have 37,000 gigawatts of generation across 20 states currently, and we are the largest generator in Texas. We are a competitive power provider, so we do not have a regulated rate base. We operate in only the competitive markets, and we operate in every ISO except for SPP. And so what I think is important about this conversation is Texas is actually kind of on the leading edge of the reliability challenge that this entire country is going to have. When we go around and talk to policymakers and regulators in other states besides Texas, often some of them will sort of dismiss, Winter Storm Uri as, well, that's just indicative of market problems in Texas. And, in PJM, for example, they'll say, well, we have a capacity market, so that's not going to happen here. It's not the case. Every market in the United States is coming out with data in the last year or so showing that we are going to have a collision between reliability, sustainability, and affordability. And we talk about those 3 values as something that Vistra strives to balance every day. And we rank them in order of reliability, affordability for our customers, and then sustainability in that order. And that's because while we care greatly about decarbonization, and we've done probably more than many in our industry to decarbonize, we've retired more coal plants in the last 15 years than any other country, any other company in America. Our customers tell us they want their lights to stay on and they want to be able to pay their electric bill. So we have to elevate those 2 values as well. And I think what's interesting about what Texas is going through is Texas's current grid actually looks like the grid that all grids have been trying to achieve for years now. We have a ton of solar, we have a ton of wind, we're having an increasing amount of batteries, we have more renewable generation than any other state in the country, and we have a lot of coal that has either retired or will retire in the coming 3 to 5 years, and we've had very little gas generation built in the last 5 years. That's the grid that sustainability advocates say they want. And I think it's the grid that all of us in theory do want to work towards. But it also is a grid that causes what has happened this summer, which is, and this is what's a couple of these slides, winter and summer. I'll show a couple of illustrations here. I think on a normal given day, even in Texas and really in any grid, the mix that we have works well. In fact, on an average day, we can sometimes be generating up to over 20% of our energy from solar and wind, which is great because that's carbon-free generation. But what we need to plan our grid for are the extreme weather days, because those are the days when load ramps up, conditions get tight, and when the sun goes down and the wind is not blowing as expected or it hasn't ramped up, that's when you need your thermal fleet, as Michael talked about this morning, to back up those intermittent resources. So this first slide here is an illustration of ERCOT generation during Winter Storm Elliott, and then again during Winter Storm Mara, which is not as well known, but was earlier this year in kind of late January, early February. And what this slide shows is that you've got your nuclear power, which is base load power. You can see it's just steady and strong the entire time in orange. Then you've got the coal power that we have left on the grid. This is representing less than 40-year-old coal plants. That's also kind of just base load and staying, pretty steady. And then you've got your wind in green, your solar in yellow, gas in blue. And then what we've tried to represent here in red is our thermal fleet, both coal and gas, that's greater than 40 years old. And the reason that that's important is because those are assets that are at risk of retirement soon. And you can see in these charts that you cannot meet the peak load on these days without those 40-year assets, greater than 40-year-old assets. And so that means that as those assets come off the grid, we have to have assets that will replace those with generation that's available when you need it. And what happens in the winter in particular is when solar gets to basically zero because the sun goes down, and it's a really cold day. On really cold days, wind actually doesn't blow. So you've got this situation where the white arrows are, where sun's going down, wind is low still, and the thermal fleet has to ramp way up to accommodate that condition. So that's the winter, and then this is a slide showing August 10th, just last month, here in ERCOT, and a similar pattern showing that when the sun goes down in those late hours, wind is starting to ramp up, but there's a dip there, and we all saw it this summer. It's kind of between this, 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. period where the sun is setting, the wind hasn't yet ramped up, the wind gets greater at night, and these thermal sources have to really ramp up their generation to take care of what's happening. And then the right side just shows what Bill was referring to, which is kind of the peak demand that has just gone up exponentially in ERCOT. What I would say about that issue is, PJM, which is a capacity market that has always had an abundant amount of kind of reserve margin, meaning they have a lot of margin in their system to take care of tight conditions. They came out this summer with a report called the 4R report. And for the first time, PJM said, if we do not slow the pace of retirements of thermal assets and increase the pace of adding some additional baseload capacity, PJM will have a capacity shortage in the next 5 to 7 years. MISO just this week, which is a market that includes parts of East Texas as well, announced that in the 24-25 planning year, which is not very far away, they are projecting themselves to have a 2 gigawatt shortage of capacity if load is as projected. And that will grow to 9.5 gigawatts of shortage by the 27-28 planning year. So again, this is not just an ERCOT issue, this is happening across our grid, and the question is, how are we going to meet that demand? This is just another slide I thought was interesting. It's from August 21st, and it shows that in the morning hour, so we focused a lot on the evening hours where things get tight. In the morning hour, again, before the sun is really at its fullest output, before when, or as the wind begins ramping down, kind of in the 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. period, the blue line represents that thermal dispatchable generation is representing more than 95% of our energy output. So the notion that we can do without these thermal plants is just not based in reality. And yet we have a picture here of very little dispatchable generation is currently planned in ERCOT. So out of about 30,000 megawatts that's currently in the interconnection queue in ERCOT, only less than 1,000 is dispatchable gas generation. And that's what policymakers are trying to address here and across the country in terms of how do we make sure we have that backup fleet for when the intermittent resources are not available.
So Stacey, that was such a great intro. Maybe one thing you could just add to the discussion, because I think people, they perceive, obviously you have different flavors, but you kind of referenced it a little bit in Dallas, managing this technically, power on, power off, flavors up, flavors down, like just the technical challenge. It's not just, quote, sometimes some flavors aren't there. There's a real technical challenge to bring this together and make it work.
Yes, thank you for asking that question, because one of the things we talk about a lot is these news stories that we saw all summer. When things get tight, sometimes, the news stories come out and say, well, there were all these thermal plants that tripped offline, or there were thermal plants who were in outages at, 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of generation, maybe that was not available thermal in terms of the thermal fleet. Machines break. Machines need outages, they need repairs, they need maintenance, and that's all machines. That includes wind farms, that includes solar panels. And so there was never a moment this summer when there was a higher than expected amount of thermal outages. You have to build a grid that has some capacity for machines to have outages. You cannot expect 100% of any machine to run 100% of the time. That's just not the way that they work. And so the problem is our grid currently in Texas and at least the way people think about it is they expect our thermal fleet to just be there 100% of the time on a moment's notice every day, 24/7, because the wind and solar in their minds, well, yeah, we know the sun goes down, we know the wind doesn't blow there sometimes, so those assets kind of get a pass. But the thermal fleet's expected to run all the time. And we've got to do a better job, I think, as an industry in educating people that there is a certain amount of outage of thermal that you're going to expect. There are brief resting periods that those plants need to take, which we're starting to do right now that the hot weather is over. This will be our outage season to try to repair. But our plant operators work so hard every day to keep those plants on. And there were times this summer where they had to make decisions like, okay, we know there's going to be really tight conditions tonight. We see a problem with one of our plants, and we need to decide whether to run it tonight through the problem to meet the demand that's there, knowing that once we get past that peak and we take it offline, it may not be available tomorrow because we need to do some temporary repairs to keep it going. Or do we take it off in the morning, seeing the tight grid conditions tonight, try to get it repaired in time for 7 or 8 o'clock and get it back on for tonight? So those are the kind of things that our employees are out there just trying to figure out every day in terms of what's the most optimal way to operate those plants for the grid in order to keep everyone's lights on.
Pete, as we turn to you, and then Maria, we gotta get to the nuclear flavor and its impact on all this. But when Stacy was talking, Pete, I was thinking, power. When you and I met 20 years ago,
Yep.
Power was not the super stressed, oh my God, what's going to happen industry. It was the steady, predictable. It earned a certain return. It was old, reliable. Yeah, it had a little. Unfortunately, it wasn't. It didn't have as much excitement. It's stunning how it's changed. Also, about 20 years ago, you guys started ECP.
Yep.
So maybe just talk about your original vision of like, hey, what are we trying to do? And then what's the firm look like now? Because you see all these flavors as an investor and have to make choices about where you're putting your money.
Yep, and so maybe it'll be helpful to talk a little bit about, from an investor's perspective, how do we look at all of this, right? Because I think it poses both exciting opportunities to invest, exciting opportunities to address the problem that society's facing today, but also a lot of challenges. And so I want to get to all that. But by way of background, so ECP, we've been investing in power assets since our inception, which was over 18 years ago. We've raised over $25 billion in that 18 years. Half of it has gone into power generating. In fact, we're the largest financial owner of gas-fired power generation today in North America. We anecdotally took private Calpine, a phenomenal steward of power assets, one of the largest players in the country, one of the biggest players in Texas, in California as well. And they too, Stacy, just like Vistra, right, have been responsible stewards ensuring that the lights stay on in states like Texas and in California, but dealing with multiple challenges. When we look at the world of power today, right, we start with a lot of the themes that you've already heard expressed. Number one, there's an explosion of demand coming for power generating assets, and our stats would suggest that over the last 20 years, power growth's actually been pretty anemic. It's been less than GDP. Some of the estimates are 70 to 80% of GDP, in most recent years even less than that. Going forward, there's a doubling of power consumption expected over the next 25 years, which is stunning growth, and growth we haven't seen in our lifetimes in power. And what's it caused by? The electrification of all things. The biggest driver is, of course, taking the internal combustion engine and going to the electric vehicle. And that alone is going to spur tremendous need for electricity consumption. So you've got great demand for power. You've got supply shrinkage, right? We've got, in the state of Texas, if we're talking about 120 gigawatts nominal capacity, almost a quarter of it is either old pre-2000 steam turbines that are too expensive to operate, or coal plants, right, which are being afflicted by the many rules that are coming online that will cause these coal-fired power plants to have to spend significant money on coal ash disposal, on NOx reductions, and these are going to be, for many of them, detrimental and prevent them from running. So you can see 20 to 25% of the fleet just being taken out over the next 5 to 7 years. So you've got that theme. And then the other big theme, I would say, is all of the rules that are being pushed by the federal government, the Inflation Reduction Act, I do want to come back to that and what that's causing, are spurring the adoption of renewables everywhere, right? Tremendous penetration. Here in the state of Texas, I think there's something like 15 gigawatts of solar running today, maybe a little bit more. In the queue, there's over 120 gigawatts of new solar that's trying to come online. Now, all that won't come online. Peak demand in the state of Texas is 80 gigawatts, right? You got 120 of solar that is non-dispatchable, highly unreliable, and that's the punchline, right? The push or the press for more and more renewables creates a fundamentally unreliable grid and an unreliable system. Because as has been pointed out, when the sun goes down, and last I checked, it goes down every night, right? You need something there to back you up, and wind is not dependable. In the state of California, we know around 6 p.m., if at 3 p.m., 100% of your power in the state of California can be provided by renewables, by 6, it's less than 10%, all right? And so the rest of the grid's got to power up and turn on. So reliability becomes an important goal. Decarbonization, society seems to have embraced that, but reliability, people seem to be forgetting about. So as we look at the situation, as an investor, it is, you would think, a fantastic time to be an owner of gas-fired power plants, right? Tremendous demand growth, supply shrinkage, meaning the remaining assets are going to be really, really valuable. There's a call for more reliability. So why aren't we seeing more baseload power plants get built? I'll start with the existing fleet. The existing fleet are appreciating, notwithstanding the fear or the risk that at some point gas is going to disappear, right? We're not going to have gas in 20 or 30, 40 years. So why should a gas-fired power plant have much value today? Well, it has a tremendous amount of value today because even though renewables are making inroads and cutting in on how often a gas-fired power plant runs, when that gas-fired power plant runs, it is running on an emergency basis. It is being called on to keep the lights on. And so the margin it can earn in that hour is material, tremendous, right? So the profitability in those scarcity hours when a gas-fired power plant is asked to run is increasing. And regulators are realizing they need to continue to offer that. And that's why Texas has done some very smart things, changing the rules to ensure that in times of stress, in times of scarcity, realizing that no baseload is being built, we got to make sure the existing fleet can rise to the challenge. And so there are incremental payments that are offered for the existing fleet to be there. All right, so existing power plants right now are doing very, very well. Why is no one building new power plants? We've built combined cycle power plants, we've built peaking power plants years ago. Today, just fundamentally, it's not economic to build a new power plant, notwithstanding all of these rules and trends. And the reason is, when we look at the incremental dollar and where we should invest it on behalf of our investors, the best return, believe it or not, is in all of the renewables opportunities and all of the energy transition opportunities. And the reason for that is the government is giving a tremendous grab bag of goodies and subsidies and incentives to push that agenda. And it is very lucrative to pursue that agenda when the government's handing out free money. For baseload dispatchable assets, the cost to build today are extraordinarily high and higher than they've ever been given inflation, given the scarcity value of steel, given how difficult it is to find labor. So the cost to build have gone up. And then if you look forward curves in the near term appear like they reward you for taking the risk. But beyond the near term, and it takes you at least 3 years plus to actually, once you start construction, to build one of these facilities. After 3 years, it's not clear whether the economics will be there. And there's no, in many places, there's not an adequate system to ensure that the economics will be there once you've invested the capital and got the plant up and running. Because again, everyone's focused on renewables. So it's a phenomenal time to be in the energy business and to want to pursue power, okay? It is a very challenging time, however, to risk the capital in what is needed most, which is reliable baseload thermal.
If I can chime in for just a second, I want to add to what Pete said. One of the things that our markets don't recognize today is the value of reliability. Reliability has a cost. But if you think of the inverse of that, the lack of reliability has a huge cost as well. And we saw that during Winter Storm Uri. And so policymakers need to think about things beyond, in addition to sustainability, and you've got to put reliability at the top of the list, like Stacy was talking about. That's the way ERCOT looks at the hierarchy of things. Reliability, affordability, sustainability are the way we look at it. But the markets don't recognize that yet, and the markets need to start being reconstructed to recognize that, and that way you'll have the capital investment put into those reliable types of generation resources that we need, which Maria's going to talk about.
While we're on this, because I was also struck by, Stacy, your comment. Bill, do you think it's fair? We used to have a world which seemed like it was reliability, affordability, sustainability. Then we kind of seemed to enter a world where sustainability was suddenly number one. And then we went, uh-oh. And then we said, well, they're all tied. We thought this was a great compromise. They're all the same. Mm-hmm. Are we now going back to reliability, affordability, sustainability? Is that where?
I can guarantee, I can't speak for the other ISOs, but I can tell you ERCOT puts reliability and conservative operations at the top of the list, and affordability is next, and sustainability. And look, it's the same thing. If you look at China or India, if they have to choose between sustainability or building a coal plant to keep the lights on, they're going to invest in a coal plant.
Well,
and it's I think Robert Bryce calls it the iron law of power.
Well, I think what everybody's been struck by, Europe, when they start having trouble, back to coal. No different. Could I ask the team, would you mind pulling up Stacy's first slide as we turn to Maria? Because I just want to highlight how important nuclear is. So nuclear and coal, if you remember in the slide, we'll pull it up. Oh, there they are. So nuclear and coal are, the two most reliable or, dependable, predictable flavors on there. And yet nuclear comes with, it's basically a zero emission or very modest impact. Why, Maria, and Michael said it this morning, we all kind of instinctively know, God, that's got to be the best flavor on that whole chart. And we used to do it. You're all over the world talking to everybody who's interested in nuclear. Give us an update on how nuclear is going to come back and be the flavor that we all know it should be.
Well, thanks, Maynard, and thanks for inviting me to be on this fantastic panel today. I guess I'll start by just giving you a flavor of what even is that nuclear fleet that the United States has today. So we're about 20% of the energy that the U.S. uses, and you should be very proud of your nuclear fleet. We operate best in the world. So for over 2 decades, we've had a greater than 90% capacity factor, which means we've run greater than 90% of the time that's expected. That's a very high number, and I offer that we've been doing it for more than 2 decades to just say you didn't get lucky and it just happened last year. That's what you're hearing here when you say about counting on nuclear and nuclear being very reliable. And so we do that very well in the United States. And I'll reflect on, Maynard, what has been talked about a little bit earlier. Nuclear has not been the most popular. We can talk about, why and whatnot, but it hasn't been. And I would just say, as you look across the world right now, and I do travel quite a bit. I'm headed to Austria here in a week or so to attend a general conference that the International Atomic Energy Agency puts on. And so you would say, look at the actions of Russia on Ukraine, and they turned off the gas supply, essentially, to Europe. That caused a lot of people to wake up and say, well, that doesn't feel very energy secure now, does it? And so simultaneously, as we've gone through that experience, everybody has lifted up their heads, and they've looked to the United States, and they said, are you guys doing nuclear? Because they're all very interested in nuclear, and I can just rattle off a few countries, but France has changed their mind. They were going to sort of reduce some of their nuclear. They've made a U-turn. They've talked about the additional number of plants that they want to build. Poland, very interested to work with the U.S. on nuclear. Romania, the same. Bulgaria, essentially all of the countries that live next door to Russia. Finland is a great example. They had a partially built nuclear plant they were building with Russia. After they saw the actions, they said, not so much. I'm not going to finish that plant. I want to build with somebody else. 1-800 the United States, are you guys building nuclear? We need some help and some attention. So I would just try to paint not just a US picture. I would say around the world today, you have countries that have nuclear that are continuing it, countries that weren't talking about nuclear that have changed their mind and they are wanting to build nuclear, And you have two superpowers in China and Russia that are really very eager to be very much in the nuclear business, and they would like to build that nuclear plant in your country, and they would like to control your energy supply. And so that's the geopolitical picture that we sit in right now. Now I'll come back to the US and I'll say we have a fantastic innovation pipeline of nuclear, chock-a-block full of new ideas that are ready to come to that marketplace. And so we find ourselves at this time to say, wow, a lot of interesting new things happening in nuclear. We can not only do it here in the United States, but I'll tell you, folks around the world are very much looking to us to help them with their energy security and likewise their national security around their energy supply. So I've been in the industry longer than I want to count, Maynard, over 35 years. 30 of those years really working and operating and managing power plants. And there's just never been a time like there is right now in the commercial nuclear field. It's really unprecedented. And just to maybe give you a sprinkling of things, you know, the nuclear you know today are large sort of gigawatt-sized plants. That's what she operates, and that's the fleet also that you're looking to purchase. The nuclear of tomorrow is going to be, yes, some of that. It's what we just built in Georgia as an example. But it's also going to be smaller, 300, 400, 500 megawatts, and then really small, like 20 megawatts or less than 20 megawatts. And so what that means for nuclear is that whereas before, yeah, it was big and it could fit in certain places, now we have this suite of nuclear that can pretty much go anywhere. And so now you're looking at some of these kind of hard to decarbonize places, whether that be in Africa, whether it be some remote locations, or very established places like we are here in the United States with markets that are ready for sort of large power sources. And all of a sudden, nuclear can fit in all of that. So it's very, very interesting, but it doesn't mean it's easy. And it's not easy. And the conversation that you heard earlier today, and perhaps the investors here are going to say, yeah, but Maria, it costs a lot. And, you know, gosh, it takes a long time. And yeah, you're right. Some of that's absolutely true. I'll reflect on our behavior as a nation. We haven't been building nuclear in a while. And you say, well, why is that? Well, you kind of heard it earlier today. The demand for energy over the last several decades, it really has been flat. So there really hasn't been a strong demand. And with the energy efficiency that we put in place, which is a good thing, it offsets some of the increase. So it ends up with kind of a flat profile. At the same token, you have price of gas going very low and high subsidies on wind and solar at the state level and at the federal level. None of that favorable to nuclear. Okay, so let the market decide so you don't build it. When you don't do something for 3 decades, you are not going to come out of the gate, and it's not going to be your best day, right? We didn't have supply chain. We didn't have, we introduced some new things in the regulatory frame. So when people look at Vogtle down in Georgia, which has just finished their Unit 3 and is rapidly approaching completion of their 4th unit, you can even see the improvements from Unit 3 to Unit 4 are staggering. And so what that really tells you is we got to get good at nuclear. And I'm very confident in the talent that we have here in the United States that we can absolutely do it. But I'll be honest with you, yeah, it's not easy. From that first unit to probably the 4th or 5th of the same kind of unit, we're expecting probably a 30 to 40% reduction in the cost. And that came out in a recent DOE report called the Advanced Reactor Liftoff Report. So what it tells you is, you look at all of these charts and you say, yeah, what I really want is that dependable, reliable, 24/7, round-the-clock service, dispatchable energy. And if you could throw in that it happens to be clean, doesn't have any, pollution, and if you could throw in, by the way, if it doesn't produce carbon, do you have anything like that? Yeah, we do. It's called nuclear power.
Yeah.
One thought for you, Maria, because we do have a number of young people in the audience. I know at the NEI and broadly in the industry, you've done a lot of polling around the world by all kinds of ways to splice it and dice it. And I think the punchline around nuclear is that young people are honestly more worried about climate than they are the problems with nuclear. But tell us about acceptability of nuclear in the public and how it may not be what we think it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a study recently done by a group called Potential Energy, and I think the owner of that is John Marshall. And so they actually went around the world polling on nuclear, and their polling was more than 1,500 people, I'd say, around the world. And they got all this data, and then they kind of bucketed it with, sort of how do you slice and dice all of that. So his report has a lot more detail. I'm just going to stay at a very high level. What's very interesting about nuclear is you have a lot of people that say, well, I'm okay with it, but it's that other guy. And sort of everybody points to somebody else that they think has a concern. And so they really kind of boiled that down in this report. And what they found was that there's 15% of the population that is hard fast against nuclear. And it doesn't matter what you say, how many facts that you have, anything else you compare it to. There's that 15% that's just dead set against. It happens to be the older segment of the population. Just so happens that it aligns. And so you probably think about maybe memories and events that happened in their lifetime that left a strong impression, not necessarily related to commercial nuclear, but they've made their decision and that's it. That leaves 85% of the population that's either positive towards nuclear or able to be moved towards nuclear. And the ones that are either positive or strongly positive, I want to say was maybe somewhere in the 45 to 50%. Don't hold me to these numbers, and you can look up the charts. And then the remainder was movable. And what they actually did in the study is they said, well, what do you feel about it? And then they had other conversations and talking points, and then they tested them again. And the amount that you could move the population with new facts or current facts and a better understanding was incredible. In fact, when I talked to John Marshall, he goes, I've never seen a study where you can move people by, I can't remember if it was 10 percentage points or 15 percentage points or some very large amount once you had the conversation. And it's because of what you said, Maynard, there's other concerns out there that people are realizing, well, you have to pay a price for sort of any of these energy decisions. Now you got to begin to choose which one do you want? And nothing comes free, right? And so, even nuclear waste, and we can talk about that if that's something that's on people's minds. Everybody has a waste stream, it's not just nuclear. We just happen to know exactly what it is, exactly where it is, and exactly how it's characterized. But, solar panels are going to have to be replaced and redone. There's a lot of waste in solar panels. Windmill blades are going to have to be replaced and redone. Generally, I would say those things are on a roughly maybe 20-year time frame. I ran a nuclear plant that went in operation in 1969, and if I were to tour you in that plant, I would call it a teenager. And the reason is these plants are maintained, very well maintained. And so that's why, that original license was 40 years. And then we went for a 40 to 60 year extension, an additional 20 years. And today we're going from 60 to 80 years. So these plants will operate up to 80 years. And I can tell you there's nothing magic about 80. And so the reality is when we build these plants and we put them in service, these are infrastructure pieces. I mean, think of I don't know, the Hoover Dam or something, right? You're not expecting to have to do that again every 10 and 20 years, right? You know when you build it, that you're building it there and it's going to be there for a generation or two, right? That's how we have to think about nuclear. And so sometimes in the financials and you're looking and you're comparing them, I think we got to really do a better job of comparing apples to apples and really appreciating the high reliability, carbon-free, clean technology that we have here, and we're the best at it. So we have a wonderful opportunity in our hands.
I was thinking one question, because we sort of nosed into this, looking at all these flavors, some of the trends that are falling out of doing what we're doing. And I think the wind and solar community would say we are making great advancements in batteries, storage is coming, hang with us here, and we're going to fix this. And then I was thinking, Stacy, I think Vistra operates one of the largest battery backup facilities maybe in the world. It's huge in California. Would you mind just kind of commenting a little bit on battery storage capacity, capability, technology change? Is that going to be the answer that some people might say it is?
Yeah, sure. Yes, we do. We operate the Moss Landing battery facility in Monterey, California at 750 megawatts. We just brought on the last 350 megawatts of that, and actually I think it has another stage to go that we could build on as well. And so batteries are, and batteries started to contribute a lot to the ERCOT grid this summer as well. They were an important, I don't want to discount the importance of that resource because it did help to bridge that kind of 1 and 2 hour tight period that we had in the evenings. ERCOT is designed really to incentivize mostly 1 hour batteries. So most of the batteries in ERCOT are 1 hour batteries. Most of the batteries in California, including ours, are 4 hour batteries. And that's just an element of market design, how markets are designed to compensate these resources. And back to Bill's point, that's why these market design discussions that are going on in all of the markets, not just ERCOT, are so important, because how you set up investment signals for any of these kinds of resources is what you're going to get. I mean, if you can design market to get the resources you want, and that's the conversations, that we should be having. But I do want to, on batteries, I do want to use that to talk a little bit about, our optimism about decarbonizing the grid. I don't want to suggest by my comments earlier that we're not committed to and striving towards a totally carbon-free grid one day. I think the question is, how long is it going to take to get there? What are the technological advances that are needed? And what do we do in the meantime? That's really the question, because we, obviously with this transaction we've announced with Energy Harbor, we are firmly committed to nuclear. We believe it is the best resource in terms of reliability, in terms of bridging that gap between reliability and sustainability. And we believe SMRs, small modular reactors, are an important part of the future mix, but they're 10 years away at best. And so we have to do something for the next 10 years as we increase renewables on the grid. Batteries are an important part of that, but they're short duration. And when you have the kinds of events like you had in Winter Storm Uri or Winter Storm Elliott, and you have freezing conditions for hours and hours at a time, the batteries on the grid today are not enough to bridge that gap. So the next generation technology in that space will be long duration energy storage. There are a lot of great, we kind of refer to it as LDES for short, but there are a lot of great LDES technologies that are advancing in the marketplace, and some of them are getting batteries up to 8 or 10 hours. The sort of holy grail of storage will be solid state batteries that can almost run like a dispatchable baseload plant. But again, those technologies are going to take time to become commercially viable, to become cost effective, and they do not solve the reliability challenges that we have today and likely for the next 5 to 10 years. The same is true for hydrogen co-firing, which some of these EPA rules would require by the early 2030s. Even some gas plants, if they run at a high capacity factor, would be required under these EPA rules to co-fire with hydrogen. And again, that's a technology that is not proven. It's simply not proven to work with the machines that we have, and to do so in a cost-effective and a consistent, reliable way. I believe all of those technologies are an important part of the mix, and that we will eventually get there. But we just need to have to continue to have those honest conversations about pace and about affordability for customers. So when you add up LDES, hydrogen, maybe some carbon capture, although we can talk about that. That does not work on, that has not been proven to work on baseload plants on a consistent basis. We can talk about SMRs. We can talk about, how do we maybe find ways to build gas plants that lower the carbon emissions from those plants. We need all of those tools in the toolkit. And we need transmission, which I'm not usually, the huge advocate for transmission at Vistra, but we do need, more transmission to connect some of these resources, and we just kind of need to have that all of the above toolkit approach.
So Pete and Bill, I'm thinking we're going to circle back to you, but Stacy was highlighting these technology changes that can come, and she was also highlighting how technological innovation is not necessarily consistent with reliability, because it's fundamentally experimentation, and she also mentioned market signals. So obviously the government is kind of spurring certain things. Pete, could you talk about your investor base, what they're investing in you for, and then also as you look at, a battery technology company versus a gas plant, like from an investor perspective, how you think about it. And then Bill, let's get you in on the IRA and the market signals and some of that piece.
Sure. So what are we investing in? What are our investors looking for us to invest in? Energy infrastructure with a flavor towards energy transition. We consider gas-fired generation as key to the energy transition because we all know you can't snap your fingers and have reliable, renewable power today. So the gas-fired plants are the backup. But what does that mean? That means we invest in the gas-fired power, the renewables we've been investing in since 2008, utility-scale wind and solar, batteries. We also, residential rooftop solar. We have moved deliberately into the energy transition. So we already got our Class 6 permit for a carbon capture and sequestration facility around an ethanol plant. We are an owner of renewable natural gas facilities. We are an investor in renewable diesel. So the next generation of renewable fuels is also something we do. Now, I want to make a point, which is we're not venture capitalists. So nothing that we invest in represents new technology risk. Everything I just described is actually proven technology. So even on the batteries, we're not taking a bet on what's the next generation long duration battery and taking a flyer on it. Instead, give me the tried and true 2-hour battery or 4-hour battery, and we'll invest in that as a project alongside a solar field, and we'll back up that solar field with a reliable, proven battery that works, that's warranted, and we'll structure contracts around that to generate good cash flows and predictable outcomes. That's what we build, and that's what we do. Today, as I sort of hinted at before, I think with the incentives that exist today, we are seeing more and more capital, our own and others, go towards these more renewable decarbonizing plays. I know Bill will talk about the IRA, but I'll make this one headline comment on the IRA, which, as folks know, ill-named Inflation Reduction Act, because it does nothing to reduce inflation, but it had embedded in it the largest environmental subsidy that the federal government's ever bestowed, and they claimed it was a $400 billion-ish subsidy over time. Goldman Sachs came out and did a study and said, no, it's really going to be over $1 trillion of subsidies over the next 10 years because it's uncapped. It's not first come, first serve, or use it or lose it. It's whoever shows up in this period of time with a project gets a known subsidy. And that's a bonanza, right? That's an amazing opportunity to pursue projects that before, like a carbon capture project that previously would have gotten one level of subsidies. The government in the IRA increased it by 70%. And so projects that didn't pencil out previously now do. Now there's a societal benefit, right? Because we are, in the case of our ethanol plant, we are capturing, when you manufacture ethanol, 98% of what comes out of the chimney in the form of emissions is CO2. So it's readily easy to capture that CO2 and stick it in the ground and capture it. So that's a societal good, and the federal government is going to pay for that. You can argue whether or not we should be doing that, but that's what the government is doing. The government increased that CC carbon capture subsidy because they wanted more attention focused on power plants. Because power plants are the big polluter, the big CO2 emitter. The issue with power plants is what comes out of the chimney is 5 to 10% CO2, and mostly a lot of other stuff like NOx and SOx and particulate matter. And so it's really expensive to grab that CO2 and stick it in the ground. In fact, 3 times as expensive as it might be in an ethanol plant. And so when the government increased their subsidies to facilitate that, they got close to the costs, but they're not quite there. So industry's got to figure out a way to capture that CO2 from gas-fired power plants and coal-fired power plants so that it's economic to pursue. And I think that'll come. Calpine's pursuing a couple of projects right now where they think they've got an opportunity to succeed there. But lots of dollars and money is pursuing these kinds of initiatives.
And Stacey, you've got your chart up. I think if you would just tell people about this, because people don't realize when you capture the carbon, you use the power to capture the carbon so the plant creates less power.
Yes, this is an important point that I think doesn't get discussed enough. And to Pete's point, it's also just very expensive for the reasons Michael Cymbala has talked about this morning because of the density of the carbon coming out of a power plant. But So you've got both problems. You've got a cost problem where we show here, this is based on an actual combined cycle gas plant we have in Illinois that we ran. We actually submitted a grant proposal to the DOE and were not selected for that project, but we did a lot of work to run kind of the economics and the engineering on it. And so what this shows is that it's going to cost you a total of about $103 per ton to build and run the carbon capture project at this gas plant. The maximum 45Q credit under the IRA is only $85. So it's not economic to begin with for a company like ours, which is a competitive power company, and we have to do things that have a return for us. But in addition to that, the topic that doesn't get discussed a lot is it takes about 30% of the gas plant's output just to run the process of carbon capture. So you're taking that 30% of the energy. So on this plant, it's a 1,280 megawatt plant, but by the time you run the carbon capture process, you're only sending 896 megawatts onto the grid for energy. And the reason this is important is because it ties back to the discussion we've been having about reliability at a time when we need all the megawatts we can get, especially during extreme weather events, to do carbon capture. And then the last one I'll show here is hydrogen co-firing or hydrogen firing for power generation is a similar problem. You're taking megawatts off the grid to make that power cleaner. And so that's just a tension that we're going to have to confront when we look at these issues. So in the case of hydrogen, and I think everybody reasonable recognizes that hydrogen for power generation is a last use case for hydrogen. There are a lot of other uses for hydrogen that would come before this, but this is just a way to show you if you have 1,000 megawatt hours of emissions-free power to produce hydrogen. So this is to produce clean hydrogen or green hydrogen or pink hydrogen or whatever color you want to call it. So that could be 1,000 megawatt hours of nuclear, or it could be solar or wind. You take that power to power an electrolyzer to make the hydrogen. You're going to consume about 250 megawatt hours to make that hydrogen. So it's a 75% efficiency rate. Then you're going to take that hydrogen and you're going to put it into a gas turbine to make more energy. You're going to have taken 1,000 megawatt hours of emissions-free power, run it through a gas plant, and come out with 300 megawatt hours of carbon-free power. That just doesn't make sense. I mean, that just doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make physics sense. I think there'll be, again, technological breakthroughs that address these issues, and these things will get more and more efficient and cost efficient over time, but this is just the state of play today, and this doesn't even take into account how expensive hydrogen would be in a gas plant. But those are some of the challenges that we look at all the time, and we stay very close to these technologies because we want to be on the cutting edge when they're commercially viable.
Bill, as we turn to you, and we'll talk about the IRA and government involvement, but I was really struck by Pete's comment on ethanol. It was in Michael's report this morning that we now, the U.S. corn crop, more of it goes into ethanol than into food. So the government is subsidizing the production of ethanol, which has a big CO2 release, and then they're subsidizing you to come in and capture some of it, right? So how much is too much? The government, right? And then we get into these types of situations where we're like, wow, we put so many bells and whistles on this thing, we didn't really even realize what we were doing. Talk to us about the IRA, government involvement, markets, and how we kind of
Oh, you're going to make me laugh.
Sorry. And Bill, we only have 8 minutes.
Yeah,
Actually, you only have a few because I want to come back to Maria.
I'll try to keep this as brief as I can. Many of you have heard, when I'm on the speech circuit, I have my standard speech with respect to power is hard realities versus policymaker fantasies. And that's what describes the IRA to me. First of all, it's misnamed, as Pete said. For the life of me, I can't understand how anybody came up with that name. It's just nuts. But the goals are laudable. Look, you want to have reduced carbon. That's great. Okay. But it failed to recognize some other things. It failed to recognize that reliability has got to be part of your policy goal. It doesn't care about that. The second thing is national security ought to be part of your policy goals. It doesn't recognize that either, because if you think about The way the IRA is directed, which has a lot of taxpayer dollars directed toward wind and solar and batteries, those are foreign sourced. The materials are foreign sourced. The manufacturing is typically foreign sourced. That's not good for national security. So I'm not going to criticize the IRA as much as I'd like to say what it should have done is to say, what is the X prize to have a United States energy system that is reliable, that's locally sourced, and that is sustainable? And you put it in that order, and then say, okay, here's several $1 billion. Now you, the private sector, go out and develop those tool sets to get us there. And who knows? I mean, that might have been the moonshot approach. We need to get SMRs here in 5 years instead of 10, or to get carbon sequestration here in 5 years at an affordable cost instead of 10, or whatever it's going to be. That's so. I'm going to flip your question, Maynard, to say that's what policymakers should have done, but they all got caught up in the hype of that you typically see in Washington. Look, I'm a former policymaker, so I can get by with saying this. And they should have taken a step back. And I will go ahead and add on an editorial comment, and that is the best solutions that come out of Washington are usually bipartisan. When one party crams something down the throats of the other party, the American people lose. And so it would have been a lot better if whatever the name of the act is, the Reliable Sustainable Power Act of whatever, had been bipartisan. I think we would have had a lot better solution, would have had a lot more thoughtful solutions, because you would have gotten more stakeholders in the room so that we could actually achieve what that act is intended to achieve.
So, Bill,
And that was 3 minutes.
no, that was awesome. Well, and you touched on something that Tim Leach brought up, which is in the agreement around let's export oil again. That was bipartisan. And he also talked about looking forward. You know, we need the great compromise. Let's put all these things on the table and come up with something that works for everything. Maria, I think one thing that's really fascinating about nuclear, unlike some other sources of power, nuclear seems to be a place where both Democrats and Republicans like it, which is unique. Do you want to just talk about, sorry to mention politics so directly, but it is interesting that both parties do seem to embrace it.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks for mentioning that. And it hasn't always been that as the case. And so I would just share there's not too much you can get people to agree on in D.C. You would be very familiar with that. But nuclear power nowadays is actually one of those. They come to nuclear perhaps for different reasons. But I will refer to the act before the Inflation Reduction Act in the bipartisan infrastructure package as an example. And there was a lot of support for nuclear in that bipartisan infrastructure package. They created the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, for example. That was a $6 billion add, and then there was also support for the advanced reactor development projects, and I think it was $2.1 billion for that. And so there was fingerprints very strongly in that bipartisan legislation for nuclear, and I think that says a lot. Again, I would reflect the Trump administration was very favorable to commercial nuclear. The Biden administration is very favorable to commercial nuclear, and that is also a very small subset of things. What that tells us is that there's durability. So when people want to work on something for nuclear, and nuclear needs that, because nuclear is a long-term play. Nuclear is a strategic play, and you need to ensure that you're going to be able to go from one administration to the next, one party to the next. And so, again, come to us for different reasons. Normally the Democrats are a little bit more about climate and carbon-free. The Republicans more about national security, energy security. They've fundamentally been stronger supporters for nuclear. Both sides come to us for jobs. We haven't talked too much about jobs here today, but a lot of very good long-term jobs in nuclear. Some of the other things we talk about as we transition, renewables, for example, there's jobs to construct, but there's not jobs to operate. And in nuclear, you have jobs to construct, and you have solid jobs to continue to operate. So in terms of what do these give back to the local community, and what gift do they keep giving, if you will, Nuclear is strong in that column, and so we get a lot of support for that. And actually, the highest favorability for nuclear is around the towns and counties that nuclear operates in. And we have about an 85% favorability, and I think that says a lot about the technology, that if it actually is in your backyard, and you know people that work there, and you see how that plant is run, there's actually strong recommendation. I think that speaks well to the folks that have a more sort of close knowledge of those particular power plants. And so I think this bipartisan support is really key, quite frankly, as we move forward, because as I said, nuclear is a strategic play. We talked a little bit about geopolitics a few minutes ago. I would also add that we have been working with our government to really appreciate the geopolitical nature of nuclear. When you work with another country to build a nuclear plant, you're forming a 100-year relationship, okay? You're gonna build it, you're gonna operate it 60, 80 years, you're gonna decommission it. And that's why it matters who you do business with on commercial nuclear. And that's why it matters if we watch China and Russia decide on their full court press to decide that they wanna build in other people's countries, right? Russia just finished a plant in Turkey. Russia just finished building a nuclear plant in Egypt. Russia is very thoughtful about all the places they want to go and build these nuclear plants. And the United States needs to really appreciate, and I would say our government now does, appreciate and understand. We brought this technology. We're very good at this technology. We're the best. We're innovating on this technology. And we need to ensure that we continue to own it, as well as help our allies. The latest view for how much is a potential add to the US in order of exporting nuclear between now and 2050, $1.9 trillion. $1.9 trillion in the market to export US technology. So when I say that we are at an inflection point today for commercial nuclear, I can't say it strongly enough. But before we're going to export that technology, they want to see it here first. So we need to get going. We need to get going. We need to build some of the stuff that we have on the drawing board right now. And we need to demonstrate that it's doable. There's 20 pilot projects today underway between the US and Canada. And I want to put a plug out there for Texas. I know, talking to one of the Texas commissioners, that he's working and the commission's working with the governor. And I think in the not too distant future, we're going to be hearing more about just how interested Texas is to get into this nuclear conversation. So I'm excited to look ahead in the near term and see what that announcement's going to be.
Well, since you talked about Texas, I want to say three more things. First of all, I applaud Governor Abbott for the nuclear initiative to try to make Texas the leader in nuclear. The second thing is, from concept to building a transmission line, it takes half the time in Texas than it does anywhere else. The time in the interconnect queue from when you have a generation idea to when you're planting steel in the ground is half what it is anywhere else. And Stacy's still nodding yes, so I must be telling the truth. And then lastly, we're doing some innovative things like virtual power plants. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but Tesla came to us with an idea a few months ago and said, hey, we'd like to try this concept. Will you approve a pilot program to let people that have their individual solar systems or their Tesla cars or their power walls sell power back into the grid? And so now they're, Vistra's got as part of that program. There are other companies that are part of that where we've got this pilot program up and running. And it's small right now, but that may be the wave of the future as well in terms of everybody becomes part of it, an owner of the grid, if you will, in terms of generation resources.
Right.
Last question, because we got to wrap up. This has been so awesome. It's just so hard to let you guys go. The lead-in was we have a world where power is getting more expensive and less reliable. I'm thinking maybe Pete and Stacy, Bill, all of you, as you look at power prices in the country, right? And this is where we talk about, when are people going to notice? Well, when your bill goes up, okay, now we're going to notice. What do you see happening? Just give us a feel for what's happening with power prices, however you want to do it, nationally, in a few markets. Just give us a sense, next few years, what's going to be happening with power prices? Anybody?
Sure. Power, the biggest driver of power prices is natural gas, right? And so as a nation, we are blessed that we have an abundance of natural gas. You heard Secretary Evans comment on it last night. The shale revolution, hydraulic fracturing, set us up in a way where we've got cheap gas for a really long period of time. That said, there are certain jurisdictions that are imposing certain minimum renewable targets. I picked California, sort of one of the leaders there, and they're at 50% already. They're supposed to be 100% in the next 15 years. And you see in the bills that consumers are receiving there an implicit tax, right, for the transmission that needs to be built to support that renewable, the cost of renewable power, although it has come down materially. The ancillary costs of supporting it are rising. And what I mentioned about just the cost of gas-fired power in the shoulder hours, peak is no longer 3 p.m. in the middle of the day. Peak is now 7 p.m. And the costs to support renewables are high. And so I think what we will see is, we have seen it, people's bills are getting more expensive. There has been surprisingly little pushback in jurisdictions like California, because I think there's a value placed on decarbonization there that overcomes some of that. But I think it's hard to predict that the costs are going to come down anytime soon.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things. One is California, which has experienced and is experiencing price increases, they've also just recently started to implement, I forget what the name of it is, but basically progressive electricity billing, where your electricity bill will be partly based on your income. It remains to be seen how that really could be implemented in many other parts of the country and whether people would accept that. But I think that shows that they're struggling with the fact that the rising electricity costs are falling, disproportionately, obviously, on low income consumers of energy. So that gives me, and I think we haven't yet seen the full impacts on electricity bills of the energy transition, because we're actually funding most of it through tax credits. Mm-hmm. So taxpayers are actually funding the energy transition, which has blunted the effect on energy bills. But over time, you will start to see that, especially the cost of transmission. If we are really to build the amount of transmission that is contemplated to allow this energy transition to take place, you will not be able to help but see that on energy bills, because transmission costs, unlike competitive power, is a direct pass through to consumers. Whatever it costs the utility to build, that's what ends up on the customer's bill, which gives me an opportunity to say the final thing, which is a plug for competitive retail electricity markets, because I believe that's the best way. Vistra is a big believer in competition, and I believe that's the best way to keep prices as low as we can in the energy transition for customers, which is to have companies compete for those customers like we do in Texas. There is no better competitive retail electric market than the one in Texas.
Well, if there's a positive way to wrap this up, is this pressure, which is unfortunate, maybe it gets us back to the table to think about some better choices and a better way to balance all these things. Can I get a round of applause for this awesome panel?